Land Rover has become synonymous with rugged, off-road, go-anywhere capability, but also with extreme levels of luxury, a high price, and high-tech features. And all of this came from an impoverished nation and a company looking literally for a lifeline who designed a product, an agricultural instrument intended to be built for a couple of years until car production could ramp back up. This company has about 75 years of history, and today this is a far too brief story of Land Rover, the farmer's best friend. So welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I'm John, and the story of Land Rover, as told by others, normally starts with post-World War II Britain, but actually the story begins back further in the mid-1800s. This is the story of John Kemp Stanley, who worked for his uncle James Stanley, who manufactured sewing machines. Now in 1869 he switched to bicycles, and at some point John Stanley and William Sutton got together and founded Stanley and Sutton Company in Coventry, England, to make their own bicycles. The first Rover was a brand name for one of their tricycles that was made in 1883, and in 1885 they literally made history by producing what was called the Rover safety bicycle, what is now largely considered the template for the modern bicycle. In fact, the word for bicycle in Polish and Belarusian both derive from their product name. I think that's just pretty cool. In the early 1900s, the company developed and produced the first Rover Imperial motorcycle, and around the same time began producing automobiles, with their first being the two-seat Rover 8. Rover continued to produce motorcycles and cars, and in World War I even provided the Russian army with motorcycles, but in the 1920s were rough for the company. Years of losses, and the company was trying to enter a period of recovery. Motorcycle production ended in 1924, and with new auto products and new leadership, the company showed modest profits in 29 and 30 until another economic downturn led to losses again. But by the 30s, the United Kingdom was kind of ramping up military production, and Rover benefited. Profitability began to soar by the mid-30s, and the company began to work with the government on what are called shadow factories. Now, these were a plan by the government to build a factory in the shadow of other industrial and let private companies staff and manage it. So Rover benefited with 3 shadow factories, one of which was at Solihull, which made engines and airframes for the Bristol Hercules and some other aircraft. During the war, the headquarters of the company at Coventry were bombed, and they made the decision to abandon it. After the war, the company eventually rented and then bought Solihull and the other shadow factory at Acox Green, and private car production resumed at Solihull in December 1945. Britain after World War II was in a bad situation. Shortages existed of almost everything, including steel, and the government rationed steel primarily to companies that had an export product or were involved in agricultural industry, housing, something like that. Rover itself was once again struggling with limited product and a limited ability to get resources like steel for its product, but they also had these 2 large factories and workers that needed something to build. What was needed was a stopgap, a product that would sell well, especially for export markets, and could be put into production very quickly and would require minimum capital investment. Now, 2 brothers are the meat of the story here. Maurice and Spencer Wilkes worked together on a brainchild that they began to consider the farmer's best friend, but more importantly as that stopgap product which they could produce quickly at Solihull. At the time, many farmers still use horses to move equipment products around and to do work on the farm. Spencer was the managing director of Rover at the time, and Maurice was the chief designer, and he also had a farm. Now, he obtained a surplus Jeep from a neighbor, or he purchased it himself, the stories vary a little bit, and was struck by just how handy it was around the farm. His brother had come to visit him and famously asked him what he was going to do when the Jeep finally stopped working. The story goes that Maurice replied with, quote, "Buy another one, there isn't anything else I could buy." Now, if this was a Hollywood scene, there would have been flashes of fireworks and music playing, a light bulb would have gone off. I don't know if it happened exactly like that, but another version of the story is that between them, they'd actually gone down to the beach, were talking about it, and Maurice actually drew an outline in the sand of a new work vehicle, something that would be more useful than a Jeep. They quickly christened this the Land Rover. The directions to the team were it would be a proper farm machine, not just a Jeep knockoff. Now, the team bought 2 Jeeps and stripped them down to the frame, and in fact, the first Land Rover prototype was built on one of these Jeep frames. They quickly decided on a boxed steel frame, using it for strength and aluminum for the body, and power takeoffs from the engine allowed farmers to use it when they didn't have a tractor. The body was aluminum because that was both light and plentiful and provided the benefits of corrosion resistance, and with surplus paint from aircraft cockpits, the original Land Rovers all came in various shades of light green. The early prototypes had central steering, but luckily that was abandoned and more traditional steering was put in, but in almost every dimension it matched the Jeep, right down to the 80-inch wheelbase. In fact, the influence of the Jeep, as the sincerest form of flattery, extends under the body in the layout of the engine, the transmission, the transfer case, and almost everything else. As a side note, the early Land Rovers had a brutal ride due to incredibly hard springs, and actually that was on purpose. The design chief was quoted as saying, "The rough ride bounces the driver, causing him to slow down and be safe." Luckily, we don't design cars like that anymore. Well, to keep costs down and speed up development, several decisions were made. The frame was fully boxed, but instead of ordering all of the machinery that would be required to extrude these long sections boxed, they actually just bought big long strips of steel and literally welded them together. While that doesn't sound like it would be as strong, it worked and was essentially the same on all short wheelbase Land Rovers sprung with leaf springs for 30 years. For the engine and transmission, the team dug into the Rover parts bin and selected a new 1.6-liter 4-cylinder and a 4-speed gearbox from the Rover P3, providing all of 50 horsepower and 80 pound-feet of torque. The first prototype was running in the summer of 1947, and the board gave production approval in September. Originally, they thought they could sell 5,000 units of this stopgap product. But in the first financial year, they sold 8,000 and then doubled that the next year. Now, at the time, after World War II, Britain had a very high purchase tax on personal vehicles. But the Land Rover was classified as a commercial vehicle, so it managed to avoid that. Initially priced at 450 pounds, it had many options available for customers like passenger seats, a spare wheel, doors, side screens, or a canvas top. That wasn't an exactly popular way to sell it, so many of these were made standard by 1948, and the price rose to 540 pounds. But oddly, a cabin heater was still an extra until 1950. So as we move into the 50s, the market across the world was hungry for this type of vehicle, and it essentially had no competition. Jeep really focused on passenger and Jeep in America, not everywhere else. Farmers around the world, oil prospectors in the Middle East, coffee growers in Kenya, construction workers in the UK, all of them found new ways to abuse and love the Land Rover. In 1954, Rover began to offer models with longer wheelbases in response to demand from customers that the original 80-inch was just too short. An 86-inch and a 107-inch were soon in production, and in 1956 they added 2 extra inches to both of those to bring it to 88 and 109 inches, but not for cargo or passengers. The extra was almost exclusively put into the engine compartment to accommodate a future diesel engine. These wheelbase variations, 88 and 109, remained for almost 30 years. By 1957 and 58, model sales were over 28,000 a year, and the original design had 5 different wheelbase lengths, 3 different engines, 1 styling update, and 1 major transmission update. They may look the same, but Rover was keeping busy, keeping the product relevant. By the mid-50s, it looked like storm clouds were starting to brew. Jeep was considering opening a European base, and the UK's largest auto company, BMC, was designing the Gypsy to take the Land Rover on head-on. So Land Rover began seriously redesigning the Land Rover based on nearly a decade of real-world service and feedback. Since the wheelbases were just recently changed, those were held, as were the suspension and the now famous four-wheel drive system. New 2.3-liter gas engine was introduced that provided 70 horsepower and 120 pound-feet of torque. The stylists were finally given a chance to have a go at the Land Rover. The track was widened ever so slightly, almost all of the exterior sheet metal was more rounded, and the interior got an upgrade to include a slightly better instrument panel, but still nothing we'd exactly call creature comforts. Introduced in 1958, this is also when the Land Rover began calling it the Series 2, making the first original Land Rover the Series 1 retroactively. On to the 60s, and in 1961 that 2.3-liter diesel was introduced, 62 horsepower and 103 pound-feet of torque, and the Land Rover was designated the Series 2A. Development continued on some more dedicated models that we won't cover here in detail, such as the forward control Land Rover. In 1968, it got a restyle in response to growing safety regulations around the world, including locations of the headlights. Famously, the lights had previously flanked the grille, but were now moved out to the fenders. In the fiscal year 68 to 69, they sold over 50,000 units for the first time. Actually 50,561, and in 70-71 sold over 56,000, breaking the 1,000 per week production barrier. In 1967, Leyland Motor Corporation took over Rover Company, having already taken over Standard Triumph in 1960s and others throughout the 60s. In 1968, Leyland merged with British Motor Holdings to form the British Leyland Motor Corporation. Together, these brands included Triumph, MG, Austin, Morris, Jaguar, Daimler, and others. So as we roll into the 70s, the Series 2A was nearing the end of its life, but it had one more milestone to hit. In June 1971, the 750,000th Land Rover was produced. The Series 2 and 2A are probably what most people think of when they visualize a Land Rover, as through the 60s, Land Rover had 90+% market share of the 4x4 market in Australia and much of Africa, and many films often showed a Land Rover in action, especially in these more rural areas. The Series 3 was introduced in 1971, kept the body and engine options of the Series 2A with minor cosmetic changes, but was the most common by sales volume, with over 440,000 produced from 1971 to 1985. The metal grille, handily used by intrepid explorers as a makeshift grilling rack, was replaced with a plastic unit. Lifetime changes included replacing the metal dashboard with molded plastic, moving the instrument cluster to the driver's side instead of somewhere in the middle of the dash, and the 4-speed gearbox eventually got synchro on all 4 gears. Engines were tweaked for power, and both engines and transmissions were revised to strengthen them. Through the history of Land Rover, some attempts were made to add more creature comforts, most failing due to the fact that they made the vehicle more expensive and pushed them into a passenger car bracket, but also because it was still putting lipstick on what was essentially an agricultural tool. As far back as the 50s, Rover knew there was a market for a more comfortable 4x4 and experimented with a Road Rover, combining the Land Rover's 4x4 system in a Rover car. It never made it to production. In the 1960s, with the rise in America of International Harvester, Scout, and the Ford Bronco, and others showed that Land Rover, they were on the right track and right in their thinking, but these competitors were still relatively primitive. In 1967, they had started the 100-inch station wagon program with the code name Velar. You're going to hear that again later. The product began to take shape with coil springs, a full-time 4-wheel drive system, including a brand new 4-speed transmission, hydraulic disc brakes, and the use of the alloy Buick V8. Styled mostly by engineers, it was introduced in 1970 as the Range Rover. In fact, the engineers had designed a body just to cover up the mechanicals, and when the stylus came out, everybody liked it so much they just largely kept it with minor changes. Interestingly, it was originally aimed at customers like construction foremen or military officers, but it quickly became the car of choice for aristocratic landowners and was available only in a two-door until 1981. In the early 1970s, British Leyland was in terrible financial shape, with multiple brands making similar products at competing with each other and competing for resources internally, and all of the infamous management and labor struggles throughout this time. In 1975, they were nationalized as British Leyland. By the 1980s, Land Rover was its own, more independent subsidiary within British Leyland, and the two-door Range Rover got its four-door option in 1981 and proved extremely popular. The first major push upmarket was in 1984 when leather, an updated instrument pod, and wood inlays were added. And the Series 3 soldiered on until 1985 in various markets, but in 1983, Land Rover introduced the Land Rover 110 and the 90, nominally representing the wheelbases of these heavily revised cars. There was also a 127 model. The most changes were cosmetic, such as full-length hood, but it received coil springs for most models, permanent four-wheel drive, a more modern interior, and through its life progressively more powerful engines, from a 2.25-liter gas to a 3.5-liter V8. It's important to note that Land Rover sales had suffered over time, as they were not immune to the poor reputation, substandard build quality, and unreliability that British Leyland had become famous for. Japanese products such as the Toyota Land Cruiser and the Nissan Patrol slowly took over much of what was Land Rover's export market. There's an old saying that I've heard that if you want to get into the outback, you take a Land Rover, but if you want to get back to civilization, you take a Toyota. This reputation still plagues them, with studies showing it has merit, but with hindsight it seems Rover's answer was to go upmarket and luxury and cede the more utilitarian market to others. In 1988, British Aerospace acquired Rover Group for just £150 million. Before the 90s dawned, Land Rover surprised the world with a discovery at the 1989 Frankfurt Motor Show. As the Range Rover had moved upmarket and left its original niche, so the Disco was created using the same chassis, suspension, and four-wheel drive system to place where the Range Rover was originally, as a family car suitable as a daily driver but fully off-road capable. Keep in mind this was, in Land Rover's now 40-year history, only the third model line they'd ever introduced, and the first since 1970. The first year was only a two-door, with the four-door following in 1990. The interior was designed to be a, quote, lifestyle accessory, but ultimately raided the Rover's parts bin for many items such as the switchgear, the instrument pod, the air vents, the heating AC controls. The original blue interior was supplemented with an optional beige in 92, and an automatic on some models were added. Engines commonly were a 2.5-liter diesel or a 3.5 V8. In 1994, the Disco was finally available in the US, and this year many changes were made to the model overall, with the addition of airbags to meet US safety standards, and all models had a 3.9-liter engine. Curiously, if you knew that Honda and Rover were working together on cars at the time, I bet you didn't know that Honda actually sold a badge-engineered version of the Disco that was called the Honda Crossroad. Also in 94, the second generation Range Rover was introduced, and the first generation Range Rover was renamed the Classic. Commonly known as the P38, it had a stronger chassis, updated air suspension, ever more powerful 4.0-liter, 4.6 and 2.5-liter diesel engines. With the introduction of the Discovery, Land Rover added more equipment and trims to move the Range Rover further upmarket. The most important development of 94 was the purchase of Rover Group, including Land Rover, by BMW. While BMW poured a fortune into Rover in an attempt to revitalize the car brands, Land Rover continued to be profitable, with much of the profits being eaten by warranty claims. BMW believed Rover could build and design a quality product if they just had the resources, money, but that proved not to be the case, with multiple failed products and a shrinking market share in spite of successes like the Mini, and worse, being design delays and manufacturing gremlins that no amount of investment from BMW seemed to be able to fix. In the late 90s, the Land Rover 90 and 110 got renamed as the Defender, as they'd recently released the Discovery model and Land Rover needed a brand name for it. It got a new turbocharged diesel while retaining the previous 4-cylinder and 8-cylinder options. The 127 model was changed to the Defender 130, not by changing the wheelbase, but by simply rounding up. Through the 90s, it attempted to climb more upmarket too. In 1998, the Disco was introduced with 720 differences as the Series 2. Every panel was altered, the interior made less utilitarian, and it was made slightly longer, but it still used an evolution of the original 1970 Rover chassis. Sold until 2004, this version used a 4.0-liter V8 and later a 4.6-liter and a 2.5 diesel in many markets. Worth mentioning is the active cornering enhancement was introduced to help reduce the body roll of this tall and relatively narrow vehicle. In 1997, Land Rover introduced the Freelander. Intended to be a premium compact 4x4, it was conceived as a smaller Land Rover. It ended up as long as the original Range Rover and a longer wheelbase, but with Land Rover's first unibody construction. With a 3-door softback and a 5-door version, it offered 2 i4 engines, a 4-cylinder diesel from BMW, and a 2.5-liter V6. It had no long-range gearing. It went on to be a huge hit outside of America, including being Europe's best-selling 4x4 vehicle for its first 5 years. More substantial than the popular RAV4 and Honda CR-V, it was roundly criticized for not being as nimble as the other two, perhaps with not as good an interior quality as would be expected of a more premium brand, but much more capable off-road, even if it couldn't match the off-road chops of its big brothers. The 2000s were a busy and tumultuous decade for Land Rover. In 2001, BMW sold Land Rover to Ford, who made it part of their premier automotive group along with Jaguar, Aston Martin, and Volvo. BMW largely developed the next generation Range Rover, and Ford benefited from it. The new Range Rover was a big focus for BMW in the 90s, needing to get the flagship right, and involved engineers from both Rover and BMW, and it was largely designed in Munich, while Rover's engineering was focused on the Mini project. Interesting, the sale to Ford included a clause that BMW would remain involved in the Range Rover product until it reached volume production. The Range Rover launched in 2001, now had a unibody construction with 4-wheel independent air suspension, a BMW 4.4-liter V8, and a 2.9-liter diesel. Later engines were a 4.4-liter, a 4.2-liter, and a 5.0-liter Jaguar V8, and 3.6 and 4.4-liter Ford diesels. This model sold through the 2000s until 2012, and many changes made along the way, making it incrementally better. The Disco 3 was introduced in 2004, but was called the LR3 in America and Middle Eastern markets due to its poor quality associated with the Discovery name. The vehicle also used an integrated body frame construction that combined a monocoque engine and passenger compartment mated with a ladder frame chassis for gearbox and suspension. This ended up being heavier than a unibody, but it added strength. All engines on the Disco 3 were taken from Jaguar at this time, including a 2.7-liter diesel, a 4.4-liter V8, and a 4.0-liter Ford V6 in the US and Australia. The gearboxes were all new, and it was loaded with electronic traction control systems such as hill descent, traction control on all 4 wheels, dynamic stability control, and terrain response. The Disco 4 was introduced just 5 years later in 2009 and called the LR4 in the US and the Middle East, and it was an updated version of the 3. Using the same frame structure, it was restyled with mechanical changes to the engines, gearbox, brakes, and suspension, and major interior upgrades intended to offer a more luxurious and contemporary appointment. Ford intended to address reliability issues with mixed success. In 2007, the Defender got a series of changes mostly to meet emission and safety regulations, but also included a dash layout change and instruments from the Discovery 3 and some parts of the Ford Transit, and minor exterior design changes. In 2005, the Range Rover Sport was introduced. Adapted from the Discovery 3 platform, it's smaller than the Disco, originally powered by a 5-liter Jag V8, but multiple other engines and transmissions have been offered, and it ended up receiving a facelift in just 2009. In 2006, the Freelander 2 was debuted based on the Ford EUCD platform that was also used on multiple other cars such as the Volvo XC60, the Ford Mondeo, and the S-Max, with an all-new engine range including a 3.2-liter straight-six used in the Volvo S80. Interior quality and safety were upgraded, and in the US was marketed as the LR2. Although Ford only took over Land Rover in 2001, as I mentioned my Volvo history, by the late 2000s and the economic downturn, Ford was in desperate need of cash. In 2007, just 6 years of ownership, they announced they planned on selling Land Rover and Jaguar, and in June 2nd, 2008, Tata Motors of India bought both companies for £1.7 billion, including the Daimler Mark and the Rover and Lanchester brands. In 2013, Tata restructured Jaguar Land Rover so that one entity was responsible in the UK for the design, manufacturing, and marketing of both Jaguar and Land Rover. In 2011, the Range Rover Evoque was launched with another unibody design, 3 engine options, and a 9-speed automatic. It got an update and multiple trim lines in 2014. The second generation was released in 2019 with a revised design language from the Velar. The new Range Rover was launched in 2012, with major changes being the unibody being all aluminum, the first for a 4x4 SUV, resulting in a 39% tighter body and weighing a whopping 926 pounds less than the previous generation. A 3-liter V8 and a 4.4-liter diesel, 2 versions of the 5-liter V8 gas engine, a supercharged 3-liter V6, and a 2.0-liter 4-cylinder plug-in hybrid were all mated to an 8-speed transmission. The Freelander name was dropped when its replacement, the Land Rover Discovery Sport, was launched in late 2014. Based on the Jaguar Land Rover D8 platform, it offers a range of 4 gas and diesel engines with a 9-speed automatic or a 6-speed manual. As always, it doesn't offer low-range gearing. In 2019, the second generation was introduced, sharing the same platform of the Jaguar E-Pace and the second generation Range Rover Evoque. The second generation Range Rover Sport came out in 2013, following the same design language as the Evoque, but now with an all-aluminum monocoque body. In 2017, Land Rover introduced the Velar, that name taken from that pre-production first generation Range Rover prototype, the 4th model in the Range Rover sub-brand. Notable for bringing in a new design language for the brand, it shares the platform with the F-Pace, the XF, and the XE from Jaguar. It had 13 different engine options since launch. Today, Jaguar Land Rover manufactures in plants from 5 different countries, including the UK, Slovakia, and Brazil, with a lineup of 7 premium SUVs, including the very well-received new Defender. Land Rover continues to sell well worldwide. In fact, the US sales increased every year for 10 years until a 15% downturn due to the COVID effects in 2020. In 2022, they released the 5th generation Range Rover built on Jaguar Land Rover's MLA Flex platform with 2 plug-in hybrids, 3 diesels, and 2 petrol options, as well as the 3rd generation of the Range Rover Sport. In conclusion, Land Rover is one of the brands that I most love. It's a brand I associate with and honestly aspire to, much like Mercedes or Jeep. And I can envision myself in one of their vehicles, mostly one of the classics like a Range Rover or honestly a Disco. They have fantastic capability, and styling has created some of the most memorable vehicles of my life. Instantly recognizable, and I'm constantly surprised as I look back in history at how many utter variations of a single theme they offered and their unique flexibility across environments and continents. But as they've matured, they've grown into this luxury brand, and while I admit they have some vehicles that are what I would consider my lottery list of vehicles if I'd buy if cost were no object, and quite honestly if I had a Honda sitting in my garage for when the Rover breaks. But decades of poor quality and reliability would keep me out of them if it was something that I was actually spending my money on. This is a historic brand that I truly love, that I love to read about, that I dream of owning one of these older Land Rovers. But this new styling honestly doesn't quite work for me. It looks low, it looks swoopy, they look beautiful, but now Range Rover has an entire range of products that honestly look the same. I read a lot about cars, and when I'm driving, if a Rover goes by, I can't tell you many times without a pause whether that's a Discovery Sport or Velar. They just all look the same. But that hasn't hurt their sales worldwide, and that's just my opinion. I love the company. I want them to build a fantastic product that's affordable, looks distinctive, and is reliable. And I keep wanting to follow them to see where do they go from here. If you have any experience with them, please let me know below. Share some memories with us, but I appreciate you being here for this far too brief history of Land Rover. Hey y'all, thanks for watching. Please like this video, please subscribe to my channel, and please note I've got a Patreon. If you want to see your name up in lights below, please consider supporting independent creators such as myself who help bring you reviews, histories, and news opinions. Thanks guys.